Next to Mario and Zelda, Metroid stands as one of the most beloved yet experimental franchises in Nintendo's stable. And on this episode of DF Retro, we're going to take a look back at one of the most interesting games in that series, Metroid Prime. It's an idea that should have never worked, but in the end we received one of the best games that would ever grace a Nintendo console. So join me as we reflect back on this magnificent game. Metroid, of course, first appeared in 1986 on the Famicom Disk System, before appearing in North America a year later on the Nintendo Entertainment System. By focusing more on exploration than your typical run-and-gun games of that era, its unique design captivated those who played it. As a product of R&D 1, the division responsible for developing the Game Boy, it should be of no surprise that its sequel, Metroid 2: Return of Samus, would appear on a Nintendo's portable platform. While not remembered as fondly by most players, Metroid 2 is still a solid game in its own right, with interesting ideas and an atmosphere that exceeded what you would expect out of a Game Boy title. But really, it was 1994 Super Metroid that really cemented the series as one of Nintendo's best. Super Metroid is, in my opinion, every bit as good as the very best Mario and Zelda games Nintendo has ever produced. Flawless in its execution, the game exudes quality from every corner. From the beautifully realized pixel art visuals, smooth frame rate, and hugely varied environments, to the perfectly refined controls and amazing soundtrack, Super Metroid continues to inspire developers to this very day. As a late release on the Super NES, however, Nintendo would soon begin transitioning to its next platform, which of course was the Nintendo 64, and its first game there, Super Mario 64, did for 3D games what Super Mario Bros. Had done for 2D platformers. The concept of Mario was perfectly translated to 3D, with expansive maps, excellent controls, and sharp visuals. Of course, 2 years later, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time managed the same feat. Again, the formula of Zelda was reworked to function within a fully 3D environment. It worked beautifully and remains one of the most popular games Nintendo has ever released. But what about Metroid? There were rumors, of course, but Metroid 64 was never meant to be. Shigeru Miyamoto suggested that the team simply couldn't come up with any concrete ideas during this period, while others involved in the series really didn't want to work on it at all. Of course, by now, we all know that it would be Retro Studios which would ultimately be granted the license, but the path from its inception to the Metroid Prime we all know and love was a difficult and long journey. Of course, Retro Studios itself was formed in 1998 by Jeff Spangenberg, who had previously founded Iguana Entertainment. Now, I've always found this connection interesting, as in many ways, Turok Dinosaur Hunter, a game produced by Iguana, actually feels sort of like a prototype version of what Metroid Prime would ultimately become. Now, on the surface, this does seem ridiculous, but if you look closer, there are some key similarities here. Two important elements that define Turok are player movement and a focus on exploration, two central pillars in the design of Metroid Prime. Turok absolutely nailed the sensation of moving about in first person with a perfect camera and weapon sway, convincing first person animations, and a genuine sense of weight. Simply moving Turok around feels great, even in 2016. And sure, jumping could prove tricky at times, but in retrospect it actually works a lot better than you might remember. Refined character movement is of course one of the central pillars on which Metroid Prime is based. Then there is the exploration element. Turok was not an entirely linear game. Its levels were massive and players were rewarded for exploration. You could revisit every stage and were often asked to do so in order to proceed. Pulling apart the various nooks and crannies is a feeling that Metroid Prime expanded upon greatly. Of course, it's not like Retro just jumped right into Metroid. With investment from Nintendo early on, the studio actually started off working on multiple projects, ranging from things like a football title with detailed motion capture animation, to a game known as Raven Blade that was actually shown off at E3. The studio was certainly kept busy. But Nintendo wasn't entirely convinced in the end, and ultimately every project was cancelled. During one of his infamous visits, Miyamoto was, however, impressed with a tech demo known as Action Adventure, and suggested the team work from that base and that technology with the Metroid license instead. So starting over from the beginning then, Retro started to focus all of its energy on Metroid Prime, which was actually first announced back at Space World 2000, where the GameCube itself was initially revealed. There was plenty of drama along the way, including issues with its founder that led to his departure, but Metroid Prime eventually made it to market. My first experience with it actually comes in the form of this demo here. Nintendo included an early build of Metroid Prime in one of their kiosk demo discs. Now it's similar to the final game, but it does feature some slight changes which I thought were interesting to point out. We have a different title screen and menu system here with the scanline effect running through it. Different text here during the introduction sequence. Some changes to the music like this. An entirely different pause screen. And more, of course. This unique screen is even hidden within the game's data. Of course, Metroid Prime was eventually released on November 17th, 2002, the same day as Tom Clancy's Splinter Cell for the Xbox. But really, the two couldn't have been more different in terms of technology. Metroid Prime continues to stand as one of the most technically accomplished games released on a system from that era. And while Splinter Cell was extremely impressive at the time, I think Metroid Prime is the one that holds up better in the end. And of course, that starts with a focus on frame rate. Metroid Prime is a sprawling adventure, but one that targets and maintains 60 frames per second at all times. These days, games of this size rarely aim for such lofty performance targets on consoles, but it was key to the presentation of Metroid Prime. No matter what was happening on screen, you can expect that, in 99.9% of the situations, the game will maintain its target frame rate. This is one of the primary reasons why the game still holds up so well in 2016. It's simply a joy to play due to its high, stable frame rate. The game also presents a geometrically dense environment, at least for the time. The world around you is filled to the brim with uneven surfaces, with pieces of machinery jutting out of ruins that have been reclaimed by nature. If we jump over to a wireframe view of the game, this becomes a lot more evident. As we walk around, you can see just how many triangles are being displayed at any point during the game. Keep in mind the age of the hardware we're looking at here when looking at each scene. Now, for comparison's sake, this is more in line with what we would see on Nintendo 64, for instance. The leap in complexity here is enormous, and it plays a huge role in determining the overall level of detail per scene. It also helps us reveal how certain techniques work. One example of this is the water ripples. In wireframe mode, you can actually see that the surface is subdivided into many more triangles when ripples occur, enabling the fully 3D effect. Retro has basically used the polygon pushing power of the GameCube hardware to pull off detailed visuals without having to rely as heavily on textures. Things like the cracks in the various walls and other smaller details are actually rendered out as polygon meshes rather than as simple textures, giving everything more of a three-dimensional look. Also of note, Samus's character model here actually uses almost 10,000 triangles, and that's in addition to all this complex scenery you're seeing here. That's more than double of what we would typically see in other games from this time. And although the game is first person, the model is used dynamically throughout gameplay as well, such as when the player transitions between first and third person. Another important element here is data streaming. Managing memory and the spooling of data from the disk was critical if you wanted a smooth experience. We first saw this approach to loading in games like Soul Reaver on the PlayStation, but Metroid Prime expands upon it nicely. Essentially, Retro has cleverly used staples of the Metroid series such as tunnels, doors, and elevators to mask the data fetching. It's a big game with a lot of detail to load, and the game needs to constantly be moving data in and out of memory based on what the player is doing. So as you approach a door, for instance, you'll hear the GameCube's lasers start to read the disc furiously in preparation of the next room. You can see this here in wireframe mode as you approach a door and it's black behind it initially, but as it loads the new data, everything draws in suddenly. It gives us an interesting insight into the way the game loads its different chunks of data. Of course, texture maps also play an important role in the visual design of the game, but there aren't really any new boundaries being pushed in that regard here. The results are still solid though. Basically, at its largest, the game uses 256 by 256 pixel texture maps without really digging into things like bump mapping and other advanced texture environment unit features. This ultimately works out pretty well here though due to the reliance on high poly meshes. Texture filtering though is limited to just trilinear, but hey, that was pretty normal for the time, so it's not really a knock against it. That's not to say that the GameCube's texture environment unit isn't put to use here. Things like Samus's visor. It's a key component to the presentation here, and the TEV is used to create many effects, including the steam and water droplets that form. But a key detail in bringing Samus to life in first person is the animation applied to the camera and visor. Moving around the world feels incredibly smooth, with things like jumping made possible by the gentle manipulation of the angle while in midair. This remarkably smooth camera movement is one of the things that really contributes to the sense of freedom you get while playing the game. We also can't fail to mention support for typical GameCube features like support for progressive scan output, and of course the nice Dolby Pro Logic 2 based audio. Speaking of audio, Kenji Yamamoto, Super Metroid's composer, has returned once again to score the game, and his music adds a lot to the experience. Speaking of audio, I was surprised to learn that the PAL release of Metroid Prime actually includes a spoken introduction that sounds like this.
The cosmos. In the vast universe, the history of humanity is but a flash of light from a lone star. The life of a single person should be lost in space and time. But among the stars, there is...
It's not bad, but being so familiar with the original NTSC releases, it was a bit strange to hear spoken words in Metroid Prime. Of course, later on, some users discovered this hidden within the game's data.
10 years ago, below the surface of planet Zebes, the mercenaries known as space pirates were defeated by interstellar bounty hunter Samus Aran. Descending to the very core of the pirate stronghold, Samus exterminated the energy-based parasites called Metroids.
Yep, that's Jennifer Hale. Now this obviously wasn't used in the final game, but it is interesting to hear. She sounds pretty good here, but ultimately I'm glad they avoided relying on voice acting in this game, though it does suggest that there may have been some uncertainty around how to present the character back when the game was finishing up. For years though, this GameCube version that we've been looking at was really the only place where you could actually play Metroid Prime, but it was later re-released as part of the Metroid Prime trilogy. Now we don't have time to delve into each of the games included on this disc, but essentially the Wii version of Metroid Prime updates the game to support 16:9 anamorphic widescreen while introducing the Wiimote pointer-based controls first created for Metroid Prime 3. Besides those modifications though, it basically looks identical, and it's a pretty good way to revisit a classic. And while the disc-based version that I have here is extremely rare, the game was later re-released digitally by Nintendo for play on the Wii U, so if you don't have it there yet, it's definitely worth checking out. Which begs the question then, what is the best way to play Metroid Prime today? Well, while I do prefer using original hardware in most cases, I actually think in this case, emulation is a pretty good option. Yes, I'm talking about Dolphin here, which has come a long way, with games like Metroid Prime benefiting greatly in the process. Now, it's not yet flawless, mind you, but the benefits kind of outweigh any of the smaller issues that you might encounter. And of course, while the standard version of Dolphin certainly gets the job done, I'm actually playing the game here using the unofficial Ishiiruka version of Dolphin, which adds a ton of unique features that allow you to push the visuals beyond what you can achieve using standard Dolphin. For instance, you can add lots of cool additional enhancements like depth of field, ambient occlusion, various types of color correction, and a whole lot more. I'm playing it here at 1440p with 2x super sampling anti-aliasing, 16x AF, and all those aforementioned features engaged, and I've tweaked it to look pretty nice, I think, without going overboard with the effects. It's also worth noting that this version of Dolphin helps avoid the shader compilation stutters that plague the official release of the emulator, and it leads to a much more fluid experience all around. And as you can see, the end results are pretty much excellent. The game is sharper and cleaner than ever before, and as much as I prefer sticking with the original hardware as I mentioned earlier, this is definitely a really cool way to replay Metroid Prime, especially if you've been playing it on original hardware for all these years. Of course, to be fair, I haven't actually completed the game on Dolphin yet. I've only played through the first area or so I can't promise that there won't be bugs or issues later on. But I'm certainly planning to continue pushing through the game like this just to relive it with these enhanced visuals, so we'll see how things turn out. So what's the final verdict here? Is Metroid Prime still worthy of your time these days? Well, to put it simply, without a doubt, yes. Once you sit down and start playing this game again, its atmosphere immediately begins to draw you in. The massive worlds and beautiful biomes scattered across planet Talon 4 remain just as evocative today as in 2002. This is enhanced by the player movement and feel of jumping through the environment, which is just addictive. While some may disagree with this assessment, I actually feel that Metroid Prime is every bit as successful, if not more so, at translating the two-dimensional Super Metroid experience into a full 3D adventure as Super Mario 64 and Zelda Ocarina of Time before it. The staples are all here, and it just looks and plays like an absolute dream. It's pretty much impossible not to gush about this game when talking about it, at least for me. Now, since its release, Retro Studios went on to release 2 more installments in the series, both of which are extremely high quality games, but ultimately maybe not quite as memorable as the original Metroid Prime itself. After that, of course, we got the Donkey Kong Country Returns series, and now we're basically still waiting to see what they're going to do next. With that though, we've reached the end of another episode of DF Retro. I hope you've enjoyed this reflection back on Metroid Prime, and if so, be sure to like, subscribe, and follow us on Twitter. I love reading all of the suggestions. Metroid Prime itself was suggested many times by plenty of viewers after all. And until next time then, stay retro.